Well, welcome everyone. It's really wonderful to see this crowd here tonight. I'm Jane Tylis, Faculty Director of the Center for Humanities here at NYU, and I'll anticipate the reception to come. So thanks to Chris and to Alexandria and Gwyneth and Denny for getting everything rolling. I will introduce very quickly tonight's participants and take my seat. And in fact, Sonya Posmentier, who is to my far left, will be our moderator for tonight. So I'll introduce Sonya, I'll introduce our discussants, and then I'll introduce our guest of honor. So Sonya is an assistant professor of English here at NYU. She received her PhD in 2012 from Princeton and has been busy since arriving at NYU. She's just completed a book manuscript called Cultivation and Catastrophe, The Lyric Ecology of Modern Black Literature, and is already hard at work on a new book, Black Reading, about the intersecting histories of Black cultural studies and modern lyric. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times Book Review, American Literature, and the Blackwell Companion to the Harlem Renaissance. And she's already taught quite a number of courses while here at NYU. She's taught regularly a survey of 20th century African American literature and grad and undergrad courses on modern poetry, environmental literature, Black criticism and theory, and Black diaspora. So thank you, Sonya, for moderating tonight. And like I said, very shortly I'll turn things over to her. Our two discussants tonight for Phil Harper's new book are first Michael Ralph, who is an associate professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis downstairs. He holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago, and his scholarship centers on race, disability, risk, injury, liability, citizenship, and sovereignty in Dakar, Senegal, and New Orleans. And I just found out this evening that his brand new book, Forensics of Capital, is just out with the University of Chicago Press. So congrats to Michael. He's also published in a number of journals, including Disability Studies Quarterly, Souls, Social Text, Public Culture, South Atlantic Quarterly, and he co-edited, sounds like a great book, America's Games, A Critical Anthropology of Sport. He's also the editor of Transforming Anthropology, the flagship journal of the Association of Black Anthropologists. And I want to thank Michael, too, for stepping in relatively late in the game to replace a colleague who could not be with us tonight from Columbia. So thanks to Michael for coming upstairs and being with us this evening. Our other discussant right behind me is Anlin Cheng, who is professor of English and of the Center for African American Studies and director for the program in American Studies at Princeton University. So thanks for coming across the river to be with us tonight. She's also affiliated with the program in Gender and Sexuality and the Committee on Film Studies. Anne is an interdisciplinary scholar who's the author of The Melancholy of Race, Assimilation, Psychoanalysis, and Hidden Grief, and Second Skin, Josephine Baker and the Modern Surface, both from Oxford University Press. She's currently working on two new projects, a manuscript entitled Radiant Defilement, Ornamentalism, Aesthetic Being, which is a study of the role of ornaments in the conceptualization of modern personhood. This is forthcoming from Oxford. And a second study focused on rethinking critical race studies at the intersection of food and animal studies. So welcome to Anne. And finally, last but not least, I'd like to introduce the guy who's the reason why we're all here tonight. Phil Harper, as we all know, is Eric Marie Remarque Professor of Literature at NYU, where he's been a member of FAS since 1995. A joint appointee in the Department of English and the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis, of which he was the founding chair, Phil has taught and published extensively on issues of race, gender, and sexuality in American literature and culture. In addition to the book that we're here to celebrate tonight, Abstractionist Aesthetics, Artistic Form, and Social Critique in African American Culture, just out from NYU Press, Phil's books include Private Affairs, Critical Ventures in the Culture of Social Relations, also NYU Press, Are We Not Men? Masculine Anxiety, and the Problem of African American Identity with Oxford Press, and Framing the Margins, The Social Logic of Postmodern Culture, again with Oxford. Phil's had fellowships from the ACLS, from the NEH, and the Ford Foundation, and he's on more editorial boards and more committees here at NYU than I can possibly count. And I will just add on a personal note that the difficulties of serving on one of these committees for me have been much mitigated by his presence. So a public thanks to Phil. His new project, Phil's new project is an ethnographic one. He's going to be talking to contemporary readers to determine what interpretive practices they use when engaging with fiction. I hope you'll interview me. Love to talk about this. And as I was doing a little bit of background check for tonight's remarks, I discovered, I didn't know this. I knew he had a PhD in English, but I didn't realize that Phil also has an MFA in creative writing, and I think this explains both his incredible sensitivity to the written word and also the fact that he's such a good writer, as I've gleaned from reading his new book, among other things. Last but not least, he's one of the smartest people I know here at NYU, but also one of the most modest. So I'm really happy that tonight we can single him out and honor him as we discuss, celebrate, toast, and buy his book. There's someone outside who'll be very happy to sell you a copy, and I'm sure Phil will be happy to sign it. So all said, I want to congratulate Phil on Abstractionist Aesthetics. Welcome all of you here tonight, and I'll turn things over to Sonya. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jen.
Hi. So it's so exciting to be here today to celebrate our colleague Phil Harper's exciting and provocative book, Abstractionist Aesthetics, Artistic Form and Social Critique in African American Culture. And thank you to Jane and to Gwyneth Mallon and Alexandria Martinez, the Center for Humanities, for hosting this event. So I'll just give a brief introduction and reflection on the book, and then we'll have 3 presentations and plenty of time for discussion. As I hope befits a book on abstraction, I'll approach an overview of abstractionist aesthetics at a slight angle, detouring briefly through a recent installation by one of the artists whose earlier work Phil has treated so brilliantly. And this is Kara Walker's lauded and debated transformation of Brooklyn's Domino Sugar Factory in 2014 on the eve of that warehouse's demolition into a work called A Subtlety, or The Marvelous Sugar Baby, which, as you probably know, the centerpiece of which was a larger-than-life Sphinx-like female figure covered in sugar, rising to fill the high ceilings of the former sugar refinery. So among the most controversial aspects of the work was not the work itself, but the audience response of sexually and racially offensive incessant selfie taking, which Walker invited with signs, please hashtag your selfies, right? When Walker and her gallery revealed that they had been watching us, collectively collecting the selfies, but also filming the gallery for the purposes of an afterward focused on audience interaction with the work, many assumed that the artist's goal was to critique or even mock her audience. In one piece titled, "Kara Walker Knew People Would Take Dumb Selfies with a Subtlety, and That Shouldn't Surprise Us," a critic argues that the selfies and the video footage are part of the work and prove Walker's point, that's a quote, sorry, about the dangers of racial caricature. But to say that the selfies demonstrate Walker's point is to reduce this monumental and 3-dimensional work to a sharp instrument. And Phil usefully historicizes and contextualizes this sort of response to Kara Walker's earlier work in abstractionist aesthetics. But the film, entitled An Audience, which Walker edited and displayed at her gallery, Sakema Jenkins, the following fall, told a slightly different story. Among other things, the film represents a monumental African woman in the process of being revered, feared, gazed at, loved, touched, smelled, and tasted, because for the last hour that the exhibit was open, people were allowed to touch the work, by other Black, brown, and white bodies, ending with a series of Black and brown hands caressing the dimpled sugar, and then the factory void of all other bodies, only the sugar baby and one of her sugar children remaining, alight in the cage of the warehouse's steel beams. There's an abrupt cut between this first film, An Audience, and a subsequent film, Rhapsody, in which we watch large machines burn, melt, cut into, decapitate, and amputate this curiously embodied history. Somehow, between her objectification and her destruction, this subtlety is restored to radiance through the love of an audience. But the restoration doesn't take place through material reconstitution of the exploited body. On the contrary, Walker renders the ephemeral as the object of love, and this is what Walker says in an interview where she also admits to having been spying on the audience. But the gist of the piece was that it wouldn't be rebuilt again, that it would never happen again. It was ephemeral. You build these monuments, but they're really castles in the sand. It's like sugar. It evaporates and goes away. I think that side of it, the disappearance of it, the absence of it, I'm trying to understand the sort of absence of the piece through the beginning stages, with people viewing it, then viewing themselves, you viewing it, then viewing each other, viewing it, then its demise. Abstractionist aesthetics was already in press when Walker's installation, or close to being in press, I think, when Walker's installation was on view. But in many ways, I think the book anticipates the subtlety, not so much of the sugar baby itself, but of this afterword. Between the point of an artwork and its demolition, between the caricature of a Black body and the absence of it, Phil's book intervenes elegantly not only in the debates about Walker's work, which he engages directly in the first chapter, but in the broader discourses of realism, representation, social responsibility, social death, and social life that swirl around it. Or rather, while a self-avowed polemic, this book in some sense steps out of debates about negative and positive portraiture, about art as propaganda that have dominated so much criticism in Black studies over the last century. As an alternative to these arguments, which themselves take place within the limits of realist terms, Phil offers abstractionist aesthetics, that is, aesthetic practice at a remove from the constraints of representation and referentiality. He offers this practice as a space for socio-political critique rather than an escape from it. In doing so, he not only breaks down the binary between form and history or form and politics, but reminds us, and here I'm using his words, that forms have their own histories. Investigating these histories of formal abstraction, Phil turns in 3 chapters and a coda to visual culture, music, literary works, and film, not only to answer the question posed by Elizabeth Alexander in The Black Interior, where is our abstract space, our space of the real, not real, our own unconscious, but also going one step further to elaborate the kind of critique that is possible from within that space. Harper's answer to the question of where may surprise many. While he looks at abstract art from Leonardo da Vinci's grid to Kara Walker's silhouettes, and listens to the historical cadence of Cecil Taylor's abstract jazz, these are not the optimal media of abstractionist social critique. Instead, Phil ultimately claims that narrative, with its realist claims and foregrounding of character, holds the greatest potential for its own disruption. And it's this claim that I feel most personally grateful for in abstractionist aesthetics, for the way this book foregrounds the literary as central to the project of Black cultural studies, and at the same time calls for an expanded sense of what literature, and especially Black literature, can be. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce you now to Phil Harper, who will describe the book in greater detail, followed by responses from Anne and Michael.
Thank you so much, Sonya. I'm not sure that I'll actually get into greater detail than you've already gotten into, but I'll get into slightly different detail. First, I just want to thank everyone for coming. I cannot tell you how honored I am to see all of these friends out there, many of whom have only ever known me as I've been working on this book. And we've been friends for a really long time. So it's very rewarding that we finally reached this point. So I just want to thank everyone for hanging in there. A few people, of course, warrant special thanks. Anne, thank you so much for coming from Princeton. As we've been saying to a few people, we go way back. We were assistant professors together many years ago. We won't say how many years ago at Harvard.
Oh, just
and
kids.
Yes, exactly. We were very young, and we've hardly seen each other since. And so it's really, really wonderful of you to have done this. Sonya and Michael, I can't thank you enough. Both Sonya and Michael actually read the whole book in manuscript before I submitted the final version and offered really helpful analyses and critiques and suggestions. And I am eternally grateful to Michael in particular for stepping in at the last minute, owing to Saidiya Hartman's absence. And I think as far as colleagues go, I also want to single out Arlene Davila, who has encouraged me on this project since she first heard of it, I think at a 3-person seminar she and I did with Tricia Rose when Tricia was still on the faculty. That's how long ago I started working on this book. And who never stopped believing that I was going to say something worthwhile. So I can't tell you, Arlene, how pleased I am that it's come to fruition, and I really appreciate your support. And more than anyone, and I won't embarrass him by pointing him out because he's shy, my partner Tom Friedman is here, and I'm thrilled. So all those things out of the way, there are others that I could give. All I hope to do is to give a slight overview of the primary argument of the book. I'm necessarily going to have to oversimplify, but I figure for the sake of further conversation, it'll be useful for people who can't have had a chance to read it, for me to summarize it a little bit. Sonya's already done that, and I, in addition to my augmenting what she said, I'm also, along the way, going to give a little bit of the genealogy of the project. I think the most efficient way of acquainting people with the primary argument is to review the controversies that were precipitated by the works of two different African-American artists. One of them is Kara Walker in the late 1990s and early 2010s. And I'll begin with the most recent one first. Around 2010, a significant portion of Indianapolis's African-American population denounced this proposed sculpture. It was a proposed public sculpture by the New York-based artist Fred Wilson for presenting a negative image of black people. That was the language that was used in the controversy itself. Even though, by Wilson's own lights, the piece commemorated black political progress over the course of the 20th century. That was the claim that he was making, among others. But his critics insisted that the sculpture comprised a negative image of black people. Wilson specifically contended, let's see if I can get this to work because I know nothing about anything regarding PowerPoint. Wilson's contention was that by appropriating this figure, let's see if I can, this figure here, this is the basis of his own sculpture. This is from Soldiers and Sailors Monument, the Indiana State Soldiers and Sailors Monument, which is on Monument Circle in downtown Indianapolis. The construction on it was begun in 1882, and it was finished in 1902. He contended that by appropriating that figure of an emancipated black slave from the Soldiers and Sailors Monument in downtown Indianapolis, shifting the figure to what he described as a more upright position, which is what you see in the preceding slide, and fitting it with a flag meant to represent the contemporary African diaspora, whereas in the original monument, the figure is holding a broken shackle. Wilson argued that his work would at once telegraph black people's relative empowerment in the 21st century and spur viewers to ask why there still was no other image of black people in Indianapolis's Monument Circle, because at the point that he proposed this sculpture, which was in 2009, that figure in the Soldiers and Sailors Monument was still the only representation of black people in Monument Circle. That's not the case anymore, but it was in 2009. To all intents and purposes, though, the African-American critics, and they were African-American critics, of Wilson's design simply did not notice the flag element in the design. There's no mention of the flag whatsoever in any of the controversy, and why would there be, really, when you think about it? Wilson himself admitted that the design of the flag was what he called abstract. Rather, the critics seized on the human figure here, which they contended did nothing more than to reaffirm the association of black people with slavery and was therefore negative. In 2011, after nearly 2 years of contentious public debate, the plan to erect Wilson's sculpture was canceled, and the project remains unrealized to this date. Now, nearly 15 years before that, in 1997, Kara Walker had elicited similar outrage among black viewers by producing silhouette works that, such as this one here, in which, as one observer declared, and I quote this in the book, "A bearded white man puts his head between the legs of a naked girl so young that her breasts have not begun to swell," end quote. And according to this same commentator, this is evidence of Walker's penchant for, quote, depicting prepubescent black girls being sexually abused or hypersexed, end quote. Such sexualized portrayals were themselves taken by Walker's critics as comprising negative images of black people. Again, that's the very phrase that was circulated in a public letter condemning Walker's work. And a public campaign denouncing the work gained significant traction after Walker received a MacArthur Genius Award in June 1997. Now, at the risk of oversimplifying, I would say that if Wilson's detractors were so fixated on this realist figural depiction that they could not register the import of this flag design, Walker's were so fixated and so entranced by the verisimilitude of her figural outlines. And of course, this is what had always amazed people when Walker first burst on the scene, the incredible meticulous precision with which she rendered the figural outlines of her silhouettes. Walker's critics were so fixated on the verisimilitude of her figural outlines by how realistic those outlines look, that they couldn't register the overall absurdity of the scenarios as a whole, which is pretty evident when you look at it. I don't need to belabor that absurdity. In other words, they neglected the fact that the scenarios, in contrast to the figural delineation, don't look realistic at all. To invoke the term that is central to my study, neither Walker's nor Wilson's critics detected the abstractionist character of the artist's works. When I say refer to abstractionism, I mean the extent to which the works assert their own fundamental abstractness. And by abstractness, I mean their ontological separateness from the real-world phenomena that they are understood to connote. Now, in this conception, an artwork can be abstractionist even if it isn't conventionally abstract or non-representational. That's one of my primary points. And in fact, the racial political critique that both Wilson's sculpture and Walker's silhouettes are meant to forward depends upon their being both abstractionist and representational at the same time, inasmuch as their abstractionism showcases the human ingenuity that can and must be marshaled to effect social change, while their representationalism alerts us that they are indeed specifically concerned with change in the social condition of black people. If you don't have some degree of representationalism, then you can't register the black racial import of the work. On the other hand, if you don't have the abstractionism, as I call it, then you can't have the telegraphing of the possibilities for social change that are inherent in the ingenuity that produces the abstractionism in the first place. That means that in my estimation, if one fails to register the abstractionism of works such as Wilson's and Walker's, then one can't possibly discern the racial political critique that their work is evidently meant to forward. And the question I thus set out to address in my book is, what art forms are best equipped to ensure that any abstractionist elements they incorporate are practically impossible to miss? And hence, what art forms are best able to secure the efficacy of African Americanist critique that is mobilized along abstractionist lines. Now, the Walker and Wilson examples of 1997, 2009 strongly suggested to me that the domain of visual culture probably would not provide the answer to that question. And this is partly for historical reasons. For one thing, the visual realm is a place where the sort of abstractionist aesthetics whose critical potential I'm extolling throughout the book has actually long been mobilized in the derogation of black people, as is instanced in this caricature. This is a piece of, Black Americana, a knick-knack from around 1882 that exemplifies the sort of abstractionist aesthetics I'm talking about, but not to what we might think of as liberatory effect. So there are historical reasons why the visual realm doesn't necessarily provide us with a domain in which abstractionism can be most critically effective. And another aspect of those historical reasons might have to do with the histories of visual culture itself. Visual culture has developed so dramatically over the course of the long 20th century that works whose abstractionism was once ineluctably jarring are now routinely recuperated within realist interpretation, precisely because those works themselves have educated us about how to see them. A good example, and one I use in the book, is from Marcel Duchamp. This is Nude Descending a Staircase from around 1912. Of course, very shocking at the moment when it was first exhibited, but not shocking at all now. Partly, I'm arguing, because of effects that it itself has been able to bring about or help to bring about. We can now look at Nude Descending a Staircase and effectively see a nude descending a staircase in a way that people weren't able to in 1912. Visual culture is historical, in other words. Beyond these historical reasons for the limits to the visual domain's abstractionist potential, though, there's also the sheer fact that visual depiction itself enables certain sorts of presentational practices that can all too efficiently elide racial difference and have been made to elide racial difference within our culture and to elide blackness itself as an area of concern. Now, this fact was driven home to me around the same time as the Kara Walker controversy was raging, because in the very year that Walker received her MacArthur Award, there was also released the authorized videotape version of the 1975 cult classic film, The Stepford Wives, which I watched on video, rewatched when it came out in that year. There are actually two movies I saw during that period that influenced my thinking along these lines. I'm only going to talk about this one. The final scene of The Stepford Wives incorporates this tableau. It's a little bit distorted here, but you can get the gist. As I'm sure most of you know, The Stepford Wives is set in the eerily pastoral New York City suburb of Stepford, Connecticut, in which all of the townsmen band together in a plot to exterminate their disturbingly liberated wives and to replace them with utterly subservient animatronic surrogates. And the movie traces the efforts of the heroine, Joanna Eberhardt, who's played by Catherine Ross, also famous from The Graduate, of course. The movie traces the efforts of Joanna to escape this fate, which her own husband has planned for her. And her effort proves unsuccessful, as is made clear by the final scene, which this still is taken from. And in the final scene, what you have in the sequence, if I were to show you the whole clip, but we don't have time for that now, what you would see is a succession. It goes over the course of 3 or 4 minutes. It's very slow by today's cinematic standards. It's a succession of these now transformed Stepford wives, all of whom are now have now effectively been displaced by these robots, encountering one another and greeting one another in turn in the local grocery store. So this is Tina Louise from Gilligan's Island, who plays one of the Stepford wives. And she's walking up the grocery store aisle, and she passes this black couple. And the camera focuses on that black couple for just a few seconds, long enough for us to see that they're engaged in some sort of tense argument. And Tina Louise walks past them, and then they fade out of the frame, and she continues to encounter all of the other white Stepford wives, because they're all white up to this point. These are the only black people in the film, for that matter, and that's crucial. So the Stepford wives encounter each other, and at the very end, the film closes with a close-up on Joanna, the one who had been battling against the men who were trying to convert all of the wives to animatrons, and then there's a fade out. The black couple, as I say, is visible in this clip for just a few seconds. They're the only black characters in the movie, but they have been alluded to much earlier in the movie, when shortly after moving to Stepford, Joanna and her new friend in the town are told by the local welcome wagon lady that a black family is soon going to be moving into town. So earlier in the movie, we're told that. And she goes on to say, the welcome wagon lady does, that this is probably as it should be because Stepford has long been the most progressive town in the area. And it was, in fact, the first town in the vicinity to invite any of those women's libbers to come talk to a local gathering. All of this is to say that the black couple's only function in the film is to indicate a change over time, understood in a type of historical progression, and specifically a type of social progress, though, of course, the social progress is in many ways has half-hearted and mitigated by the fact that while we might be moving forward supposedly along racial political lines, we're moving backward along gender political lines, because the black woman, we are led to understand, will soon succumb to the same fate as the white wives of Stepford. If you actually read the novella on which the movie is based, you know that this is in fact what is about to happen. Because in the novella, which I decided to read after I saw the movie and thought, oh my God, black people are being used as nothing but instruments of plot development, and then they are tossed aside. How unusual in American culture. I decided to read the novella, which is by Ira Levin, the same person who wrote Rosemary's Baby. And in the novella, it's really interesting. The black couple are fully developed characters. They have names. Their names are Royal and Ruth Ann Hendry. The novella is told in 3 sections, and Ruth Ann is the protagonist and the focalizer of the 3rd section. And she's the only wife left to combat the terror of the Stepford husbands. And the novel closes before you know whether she has been successful. So this is what becomes of her in the cinematic domain. In other words, in the cinematic adaptation, black people's seeming hypervisibility allows the filmmakers to let black characters' mere presence on the screen do a significant amount of narrative work that cannot be so efficiently, or I might add so irresponsibly, accomplished in the domain of literature, where you need to develop narrative verbally and thereby necessarily complicate characters in a way that's not necessary in visual cinema. Recognizing this, as I did when I read the novella against the film back in 97 or 98, led me to speculate that it probably was in fact literature, as Sonya has already suggested, as opposed to any visual medium in which abstractionism could function most effectively and thus underwrite African-Americanist critique. And this in turn led me to reconsider why it was I had found so compelling a 1995 book by John Keene called Annotations, which everyone who knows me knows is my favorite book in the entire universe, except maybe for Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. I had recently read John Keene's book in 1995, just before Stepford Wives was issued, just before the Kara Walker controversy. Found it utterly compelling, couldn't quite put my finger on exactly why. I'm just going to read very briefly to you from the beginning of that work by John Keene. These are the opening sentences. Such as it began in the Jewish hospital of St. Louis on Father's Day, you, not some babbling prophet, but another Negro child whose parents' random choice of signs would disorient you for years. It was a summer of Malcolms and Shawns as blacks were transforming the small nation of Watts into a graveyard of smoldering metal, a crueler darkening as against the assured arrival of dusk. Selma to Montgomery. Old folks like to say he favored the uncle who died young, an artist. In that way, a sense of tradition was upheld, one's place in the reference chain secured. Digression. Brick houses uniform as monopoly props line the lacework of street for miles. Before there was Arlington, there was Palm, indeed a dimmer entity which burns in one's memory like iodine. Baltimore law. They eventually settled on a single family detached in the Walnut Park section of the city after months of wrangling with the agent, as it was quite naturally assumed that they, like others who worked for a living, would eventually own their own property. Now, when I read that, it screams black political engagement to me, but it doesn't do so by presenting us with fully drawn black characters, nor do you get any through the entirety of the book. And it occurred to me, once I started thinking about abstractionism, once I started thinking about how it was, why it was that what I thought was Kara Walker's or Fred Wilson's brilliantly abstractionist visual work was somehow failing to register, it occurred to me that Keene was able to succeed where the visual artists weren't, precisely because he was working in a medium, language, that because it necessitates adherence to syntactical rules, when those rules are violated, which is what I argue constitutes abstractionism in literature, a reader can't fail to miss it. Unlike a viewer of Kara Walker's Silhouettes, for instance. You can't fail to notice that a sentence isn't ending the way that it should. You can't fail to notice that there's no proper antecedent for a particular invocation in a prose work. And it was at that point that I realized literature is the place where you have to go if you want this mode of aesthetics to work effectively. And so ultimately, and here I'll close, I arrived at a twofold polemic, arguing in the end not only that abstractionist aesthetics can offer just as effective a mode of racial political critique as the realism that I would argue predominates within African American culture, because in many ways the book is an argument against the hegemony of realism. But I'm also arguing, as I just said, that literature, and specifically experimental prose, constitutes the art form in which abstractionist aesthetics can register most powerfully. The question, of course, is whether anyone else agrees with me, and only time will tell. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil, for the very insightful introduction of the book and I guess overview of its stakes, as well as for inviting me to join the panel. I actually want to begin with reading one paragraph from the book because, as Jane said, it's beautifully written, but also there's something really powerful about Phil's language to illuminate the stakes of his claim. Because as he says, the passage I'm going to read, it captures the limits of the visual domain to make sense of abstractionist aesthetics, but it also shows how through Phil's language we can come to an understanding of his insights about abstractionist aesthetics. So I want to read something from the latter part of page 161 into 162, and here he's talking about the film Precious based on Sapphire's memoir, Push. You get my cigarettes? Precious, still bending to her task, replies, Nah, they didn't have it. I played the number, though. I couldn't box it. After a few beats, during which Precious continues her dishwashing, her back still to her mother, Mary, evidently enraged by Precious's failure to complete her assigned errands, takes from a nearby table what the film's 2008 shooting script describes as, quote, a thick glass ashtray, end quote, and hurls it at her daughter, striking her in the back of the head. And for anyone who's seen the film, it's a really sort of sickening thud that you hear. Knocked unconscious, Precious immediately falls, but she is shown landing not on the kitchen floor, but rather onto a slightly disheveled bed, over which looms a large, bare-chested man who swiftly removes the belt from his jeans, pulls up the nightdress Precious is wearing, and climbs on top of the young girl. In a brief montage sequence of about 30 seconds, we see and hear the compression and extension of the bed springs under the man's shifting weight, an egg sizzling in a cast iron skillet amid the grease of melting fatback, the lid being removed from a jar of petroleum jelly, the man evidently lubricating himself with the Vaseline and penetrating Precious, a meowing cat clamoring on an overstuffed armchair, more bedspring activity, and the man continuing his assault on Precious as Mary watches from the shadows beyond the bedroom doorway. The camera then cuts to a close-up of Precious's face as she gazes toward the ceiling, and then to a point-of-view shot of the peeling plaster on which she is seemingly fixated. So, Precious is a visceral story based on a memoir, as I said. And Sapphire, the writer, insists that it's based on the true stories of women she encountered in life and in her work as a sort of social worker and activist. But after reading Abstractionist Aesthetics, we get the impression that a lot more is happening here. You're sort of reminded that in the film, it's a kind of dim, almost gothic scene. Everything is very greasy. Phil points out the frying pan and the fat bag, but the way Precious is shot, it's almost as if everyone in the film is also greasy, as if the director put Vaseline all over them. So it's like hyper real, but it's not quite real. So there's something visceral indeed, but also something conceptual happening. And this, I sort of thinking through abstraction aesthetics reminded me that there's something that's conceptual, encompasses visual culture, lyricism, and music. Phil has a really remarkable discussion of Cecil Taylor and his abstractionist aesthetics, both in terms of the lyricism of his, the sort of people associate with his piano playing, but also his unique style. But one thing that I was sort of drawn to in Phil's discussion of this scene, which he doesn't mention in the book, is the music that accompanies the scene he describes. It's like a 60s soul song, an Al Green song, but it's distorted, it's contorted, it's perverted. And the photo montage he describes and the music fit together as a kind of theoretical statement on the predicament of generation. It's as if Precious is distressed by what this older generation has done to her, and the sort of violence of that generation is sort of illustrated both through the sort of choppy cinematic montage and the kind of distorted or perverted music. So what makes the song so striking is the distortions, but to Phil's point, it's also sort of the way that the lyrics are transformed into experimental prose through the distortions of the music that really help us to capture what's happening in that scene. So sort of using Phil's theory of abstractionist aesthetics as a kind of point of departure, I want to talk about some different texts that I think of as being sort of in conversation with this book, and then also say a little bit about the kind of theoretical arguments I think this book is in tension with, or actually the ones that sort of I think it effectively helps to dismantle, I should say it like that. So, you know, I thought as I was reading this book, I thought of this 2012 documentary called The Art of Rap that's narrated by the rapper turned actor Ice-T, who's perhaps most famous for being the lead singer of the song Cop Killer and later playing a cop on TV. And in this one excerpt, so one scene of the documentary, he interviews the hip-hop legend, the golden age of hip-hop legend Rakim. And he asked Rakim to explain his sort of relationship to hip-hop, or, you know, what it is that accounts for his unique style, because Rakim is arguably the most influential rapper of all time in many respects. And Rakim says that he grew up listening to a lot of jazz, to jazz legends, jazz greats, Charlie Parker, these jazz legends, and that he always wanted his hip-hop music to have the effect of jazz music. Like the effect that jazz music had on him, that's what he wanted his lyrics to do to people. And I was always struck by that claim, because what does it mean to say that you want your lyrics to create the same mood as instrumental music, you know? And I never really had a kind of language for thinking about what he's saying until reading Abstractionist Aesthetics. It's also striking that in the next part of the interview, they ask Rakim to elaborate on this method he has of producing lyrics, because they say, is it true that you write lyrics on graph paper? And he says, yes, that's true. And they say, well, if someone says that, you know, you begin with dots when you're writing lyrics, he's like, yeah, usually I start with 16 dots. And for Rakim, the 16 dots represent 16 bars that he'll eventually write. And that, like, there's something about writing on graph paper that he feels helps him with timing and sequence and sort of punctuation, except that Rakim is actually writing words. He's not like drawing a graph. So it's not clear how starting with 16 dots gets him to 16 bars, or why, you know, thinking of it as dots to begin with helps him to illuminate his sort of lyrical method. But I guess in sort of thinking about the predicament Phil's teasing out, it occurs to me that there is this interesting way that sort of the lyrical is in conversation with the visual, and that there's also a kind of way in which what people are talking about is a kind of form, and that form captures a kind of mood or sensibility, so that it's not, and I think too often, and perhaps too often, we think that we have to be thinking about the same kinds of texts to understand the insight that someone's trying to develop. I guess another text I'd like to discuss that occurred to me as I was reading the book, and I guess another sort of predicament or problem of genre that occurred to me was the film Django, Quentin Tarantino's film Django. And I guess what I thought about was, I guess Spike Lee's criticism of Django. It's hard to call it criticism because Spike Lee vowed that he would not see it, but he said that, you know, he thought just the very idea of making a film like Django was disrespectful to his ancestors, and that slavery was not a spaghetti western. And a kind of similar kind of critique from a very different direction, the historian Vince Brown, who generally I agree with on most things, he didn't care for Django either, and said something like, you know, Tarantino thinks slavery is S&M. So slavery is not S&M, you know. But I wondered to myself, isn't it? You know, is it? Is it not? You know, and what is it about the way people tend to think of slavery that makes it hard to think of it in any genre besides sort of realist drama? This is sort of the question I think Phil provokes us to contemplate. And, you know, a sort of related question or series of questions includes: which genres best define the African American aesthetic trajectory? Which authors best capture the impetus of a given era? Or in Phil's language, as he said tonight, what art forms are best able to secure the efficacy of African American critique made along abstractionist lines? So this, I think Django is sort of illustrative of that predicament. It was not just the film or the constituent elements of the film people reacting against. It was the very idea of making a film on that topic in that genre. And what is it about that people found so distressing? I was also reminded of the recent sort of Academy Award nomination of the writers from the film Straight Outta Compton. And, many people sort of criticized the fact that there were white writers nominated for a film about an African-American hip-hop group with African-American cast, but none of the actors were involved or were nominated themselves. And the criticism and controversy is part of the Oscars So White hashtag that was going around. But perhaps even more striking is the fact that, the last cinematic treatment of the story of NWA I could recall was Chris Rock's 90s satire CB4. And I thought it was really interesting that Chris Rock depicted NWA through satire because, for him, they were middle-class African-American guys wanting to seem like thugs, wanting to bank on America's preoccupation with the rags to riches tale, and not actually guys from the streets. But Straight Outta Compton depicts them in a kind of realist drama as kids from the streets who, through their savvy and ingenuity, create this art form that transforms the country and perhaps the world. And what is it about, telling the story of NWA in dramatic form that was gained so much more traction than, Chris Rock's relatively sort of unremarked satire about the same group? And interestingly, Chris Rock's satire is much more accurate because, in fact, it is true that Ice Cube was middle class and that the Dr. Dre he was in Straight Outta Compton, for instance, was a kind of newest iteration of who he is, and he had been many other things before that, So I guess, it's safe to say that as Phil mentioned tonight, as many of us are aware, when it comes to African-American aesthetics, realism tends to be the norm, and that tends to be the genre in which people are most comfortable. And yet, abstractionist aesthetics encourages us to ask whether or not what we're seeing when we call it realist or think of realism is in fact realism, right? Because there's a way in which Lee Daniels Precious is a kind of distinct genre of kind of poverty porn. Going back to the point about the sort of hyper reality or the kind of false reality of Precious. So it banks on the sort of investment on realism, but it's not real in the ways that sort of people naively think of it. I guess, and related to this is sort of one of Lee Daniels' others, related to this predicament is one of Lee Daniels' other sort of projects. I thought a lot about Empire. And I guess one of the more interesting commentaries on Empire came from the rapper 50 Cent, who sees his own show Power, which is much more kind of just drama, as being in competition with Empire. And what he thought sort of as mocking Empire, 50 Cent said, well, yeah, Empire is kind of a black version of Glee. And he thought of this as an insult, the idea of a black musical, especially one, involving sort of non-gender conforming characters. He thought of this as just kind of hysterical and silly, right? And yet Empire is this incredibly sort of runaway success as a show. So what is it about the idea of this musical about hip hop, right, that 50 Cent found so worthy of mocking, and yet America so gravitated toward? And what does it mean to experiment with that genre as a way to tell stories about African Americans that are ultimately really compelling? So I think all these various examples draw our attention to the value of Phil's theory of abstractionism, not abstract art, but to that aspect of an artistic object that severs a tie to empiricism, that moment in the life of any art object that provokes a contrast, a separation, a split with forms of practice and negotiation we associate with the quote-unquote real world. The effect that an art object achieves when it manages to remind us that we are experiencing an altogether different set of relationships than those that obtain in the world around us. And, as I was sort of thinking about the texts that resonate with Phil's argument and thinking about films about slavery like Django, I also thought obviously about 12 Years a Slave and, the fact that people were I guess, waiting to see a major motion picture on the topic of slavery that was done in a very sort of elaborate and intricate way, like 12 Years, but that was in the genre of drama. You know, many people were more comfortable even with the very idea of what 12 Years was because it was a drama and not a kind of spaghetti western or kind of film that experimented with temporality in the way that Django did. And yet, I would also say that 12 Years in its own way is not a typical realist account either, because in fact, Steve McQueen uses his artistry to complicate the question of what's real, or just to experiment with the idea of the real. So there's a really striking scene in 12 Years, for those of you who've seen it, where Solomon Northup thinks he might be able to send this letter through someone else to escape, and he's not able to. And instead he ends up having to burn the letter so he's not detected. And we see like the letter just burn and disintegrate into nothingness. But it's about 30 seconds of us watching this letter just burn, you know? Or there are various shots in 12 Years like of a kind of insect on a cotton, plant, right? Where it's extraordinarily beautiful and yet sickening to think that you could have this beautiful shot of this sort of plant that's emblematic of this horrific industry, right? So there are things that Steve McQueen does to take us out of that space of merely watching a flow of action or a kind of quotidian sequence as well. And I think ultimately the film on slavery that's likely to be the more sort of just straightforwardly realist drama is probably going to be Nate Parker's forthcoming film, Birth of a Nation, which interestingly apparently broke records at Sundance, and it was sold to Fox Searchlight for $17.5 million. And it's unlike sort of Django or 12 Years. It is seemingly the kind of much more straightforward account of slavery and slave resistance and things like that. And that's interesting that ultimately the film that seems to have generated the most buzz of all is a film that's sort of much more grappling with a very predictable kind of insurrection theme, abolition of slavery theme, or something like that. And I think it's worth trying to get a handle on the kind of investment people have in that particular formulation or films in that very specific genre. And then wrapping up, I sort of, in terms of the theoretical arguments, I think Phil sort of very skillfully dismantles. I'm most struck by what Ken Warren, Adolph Reed, and Walter Ben Michaels sort of each in his own way sort of was griping about, that I think Adolph and Ken explicitly called a Jim Crow problematic. For them, there was this way in which African American expressive culture tended to see slavery where it was not, that there was kind of preoccupation with slavery as a theme, slavery as a trope, but in fact, slavery had long since been abolished. This is the position they've had for many years now. And it's not necessarily the case that they each have the same sort of theoretical stance and methodological position, so much as they sort of share this consensus despite their different sort of disciplinary locations. So, despite Ken Warren essentially being a kind of new historicist, literary historian, Walter Ben Michaels being a kind of Marxist literary critic who's more orthodox than a little bit, and Adolph Reed being a social scientist who's more positivist than he might care to admit, they all sort of in each in his own way felt like slavery was being invoked in the moments that were inappropriate or sort of excessive, right? And yet that critique, which they had been developing, especially sort of in the latter part of the 20th century, first few years of the 21st century, sort of seems to have run up against the social science literature and the sort of momentum around criminal justice reform, which has been revealing that, in fact, there are all kinds of practices happening today that are quite a lot like slavery, right? The kind of argument that Robert Perkison develops in Texas Tough or Michelle Alexander develops in The New Jim Crow. And it seems like their argument sort of has lost momentum precisely as there's this kind of investment in trying to make sense of the historic relationship between different kinds of incarceration, different kinds of bondages, etc. And, the argument that Ken Warren explicitly developed in his book, What Was African American Literature, was that, whatever African American literature was, it existed between sort of 1896 and 1954, and that it was inappropriate to emphasize anything having to do with a particular kind of African American literary identity after African Americans are fully enfranchised, right? And yet, we're more recently reminded that it's hard to make the argument that African Americans have ever successfully obtained whatever freedoms, the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act promised. And not only that, it's not also clear that, others beyond the African American constituency have been free in the ways they have liked to think of themselves either, And so I guess, all that's to say, I think the chief achievement of abstractionist aesthetics is to insist that African-American literary and artistic production is and has always been a contested space, and that the question of what constitutes African-American literature or art is precisely one of the questions that's routinely posed and seldom answered in any definitive way. And I guess in closing, I'd sort of pose a question to Phil, which is just to ask whether, literature, art, or expressive culture, and particularly, I guess, even lyricism has to be authored by African Americans to be considered African American art, and what happens if not just people who have not been African Americans historically, but what if African Americans themselves cease to identify as African American or Black in the same way? What then happens to how we think about African American expressive culture? So there's been a lot of controversy around a new reality TV show, Real Housewives of Potomac, because apparently many of these women are biracial and especially very affluent, and they have this conversation amongst themselves about whether they really want to identify as Black or have their children identify as Black. And the idea of sort of African Americans not necessarily wanting to be called African American or label themselves African American, this is sort of a long-standing debate, and yet it seems to be gathering momentum as we sort of go forth into what some people had hoped would be a post-racial era. And even if we don't subscribe to that particular sort of terminology, it is just interesting that somewhat strategically or subjectively, people aren't necessarily claiming the label of Black or African American, and there's all these kinds of aesthetic practices that sort of defy the categorization. Like, I think to myself, maybe Shonda Rhimes, show Scandal or How to Get Away with Murder could be seen as African American shows, but is Grey's Anatomy, is it or is it not engaged with the themes that have structured African American expressive culture, and what is the basis for making that determination? So I'd be curious to know what that question of authorship does for or to your argument. But I would just say that I think it's extraordinary that the book you developed manages to help us get so much traction on all these debates that until now have seemed in many ways intractable.
Thank you so much.
I've been such a fan of Phil's work for so long, but we haven't had much chance to see each other, so this is a wonderful occasion. So I'm still delighted to be here. This book has been really informative, important for me for various reasons. One of the major challenges for me as a scholar of race has been the question of how to delineate a material history of race without giving in to the facticity of race. And it seems a very important challenge, especially given how it seems to me that recently we are at a time where racial identity and the sort of the certitude of what that means and the essentialism of that keep getting reasserted over and over again. So, Phil's new book, Abstractionist Aesthetic, has been really instructive for me in helping me think about how to unsettle a set of dichotomies that have long dogged many of us working at the intersection of politics and aesthetics, the tension between art and politics, fantasy and fact, abstraction and realism, form and flesh. For a long time now, Frantz Fanon's epidermal schema has provided the primary conceptual framework through which many of us conceptualize race. Through works such as Black Skin, White Mask, we have come to understand race as something ineluctably tied to the modality of the visible and the real. Hence, critics like Marianne Doan would describe racial difference as a, quote, constant visibility that is inescapable and a disabling over-visibility, and Homi Bhabha would call the indisputable nature of this epidermal schema colonialism's open secret, reminding us that, quote, skin as a key signifier of cultural and racial difference in a stereotype is the most visible of fetishes, end quote. But is skin, is visibility, as well as its realism so readily available to us? Has the epidermal schema hardened for us into a thing of untroubled legibility? What might be some other kinds of schemas or conceptual meaning through which the idea of racial embodiment might be addressed and challenged? In Abstractionist Aesthetics, Phil reminds us of the limits of realism itself, right? Itself already a kind of fantasy. He also alerts us to the irony of a critique that reproduces the limits of a referent. In insisting on the Black man as the embodied referent in the statue that we saw, for example, the hegemony of realism often skirts the very edges of the stereotype that it was meant to rectify in the first place. Similarly, the replacement of a negative image with a positive one cannot address the logic of value and the assumption of power and privilege underlying that logic. nor can such antidote actually accommodate the layeredness and complexity of spectatorship and performance embedded within the politics of representation. The polemics between Carol Walker and Betty Saar, to which Phil alludes, for example, actually rehearses in painfully familiar ways for me, the famous debate between Maxine Hong Kingston and Frank Chen in the 80s, right? When Frank Chen accused Maxine Hong Kingston of, one, misrepresenting the Chinese community and culture, and two, for representing Chinese masculinity in a negative light, called her a race traitor, and etc. And what we should be struck by, right, is not only the tenacity of the persistence of the rehearsal of the stereotype, but actually also by the limits of our response to it. It is amazing how, in the face of stereotypes, we say the same thing, right? Another example struck me recently is actually New York audience should know this. There was a exhibit at the Met called China Through the Looking Glass, which is basically Orientalism. It's most gorgeous and most creepy. I can imagine. And of course there were a lot of protests about it. But the protest is all exactly what you might expect. People saying, Chinese people are not really like that. Or Chinese culture is not really like that. Or people saying, this is cultural appropriation. Right? So the accusation of appropriation, commodification, all like, I think completely on the ball and accurate but it's incredibly limited and he hasn't done very much, right? We just keep saying that, but it doesn't do very much. And I think to fully appreciate the extent of Phil's intervention in this new book, we have to first acknowledge how stubborn the ideology of the real is in American racial critical practice for the racist and the liberal alike. Even the most revolutionary work in race studies tend to rehearse its attachment. Critical race theory, for example, has taught us very persuasively that phenomena such as passing have everything to do with the unequal assignment of social and economic privileges and are symptomatic of a nation and a legal system unable to guarantee true equality. But even as critical race theory has done the vitally important work on unraveling racial assumptions as entirely socialized and juridicized concept, somehow the fact of blackness continues to signify unproblematically. Thus, we will find, for example, in Cheryl Harris's foundational essay, Whiteness as Property, an elegant and powerful exposition on how social privilege and subordination are structured on an entwined concept of race and property, and in doing so, she undoes the fact of whiteness. But at the same time, we also find the fact of blackness reconstituting itself in this very same essay in the form of her longing for Black authenticity, symbolized by her grandmother, by her nostalgia for her grandmother who spent her life passing as white. The call for the real, the authentic, the socially visible, and social self-making is, of course, enormously appealing for anybody who has enjoyed none of these things. But the history of the delineation of race body has also suggested that we have to attend to something that's much more fraught, that is, the simultaneous gestures of ruthless materialization and equally unremitting dematerialization to which the Black subject has been subjected. Fluctuating between being an inorganic thing and an all-too-organic body, between being property and flesh, the Black subject itself is already, we might say, in Phil's term, the product of abstraction and conceptualization. To argue, then, for an abstractionist aesthetic as a political practice seemed to me a really important and dangerous, and both dangerous but also important move towards acknowledging the abstraction that's inherent in the formulation of the very idea of persons and non-persons. The issue here is not the distinction between abstraction and realism, as Phil, I think, very exquisitely explained, but much more about how we understand the imbrication between the abstract and the material in racialized embodiment, or in the fantasy of racialized embodiment. In a way, I also think this book offers an incredibly powerful argument for the humanities, in that it insists that we rethink the assumption behind our ideas of what constitute proper political protocol. It asks us to attend to the qualitative and the ineffable that's hidden within the much more readable, right, which is the quantifiable and the material. The book explores different ways of understanding self-fashioning that do not recourse to ideals of subjective certitude or individual agency. He is asking us through this new book to forgo the security of a positive referent, to unmoor ourselves from the real and the representational in order to understand not only what abstraction can do, but also how he has already worked on us. So I'm going to just end. This is very brief because I think it's much more interesting for us in a conversation, but I do want to just leave a couple of questions on the table, questions that I think are sort of generated by this incredibly productive work, right? So I would love to talk more about what are some of the other terms that get invoked through the abstraction aesthetic that we might consider. That is to say, I cannot help but wonder. So I feel like, when Phil shows us these images, we see almost instinctively what he's talking about. But I kept finding myself wondering, what exactly is that difference between a form of mimesis or realistic reference that is clearly prejudicial versus one that is unsettling, right?
Mm-hmm.
So right here we have a contrast, right? One clearly prejudicial, which is a quote from above, and one that's unsettling. And Phil has done a really exquisite job tracking the way that Walker's so-called realism undermines itself, right? The way that the work announces insistence on its own difference in method and form from the very real history to which it alludes. But are there other terms here that we can think about? Is beauty a term? Is virtuosity a term? So I did not talk to Sonya about this, but there's this, and then this is the Kara Walker that Sonya was talking about, right? And the question is, between these images, how are we, what are the nature of the subtlety? What are, is a language here, and this is part of the show. Is her language doing some work here as another sign for us to think about? If I'm just throwing out some of these images.
The script itself.
The script is, and the script of the subtlety. Look at this versus this, or even this. When first time I saw these watercolors by Kara Walker, I was 3 rooms away, looking down the hallway at the Whitney, and I couldn't see the images very well. I just saw the colors, and they were extraordinarily beautiful. And then you walk up close, and there's the horror, right, of the image. But there's something about I know it's a complicated word, but there's something about beauty here that interests me. There's something about scale as another possible term for thinking about so these are sort of like subsets of the abstractionist aesthetic that would be interesting to play around and maybe identify. And then my second question is actually kind of a version of a question that's being asked, which is this is my devil's advocate question, because I actually don't really believe in this question, but I'll ask it anyway. Which is, what about there's sort of 2 sides to the one question. One is, do we want to be so attached to the efficacy of critique? Mm-hmm. What about art that unsettles, right? And doesn't offer us that efficacy, at least not readily? What do we think about that? And then related to that is a question of, and this is a question I have a lot, which is, to what extent what Claudia Tate has once called the protocol of race, right? Which is the expectation around an author, an artist of color, to do socio-political work, and specifically positive socio-political work, right, but to do that kind of political work. What do we think about artists or art that don't do that? And maybe it's not possible. Maybe just by saying this is an art by an artist of color, we already, So that's a good question. And then lastly, this is not scripted. This is something that I just thought of as Phil was talking. I have to turn this up because I find it very disturbing to look at. I don't want to hang you out there, So the last thing I was going to say is I sort of love that image you had from the Steffer wives. Is this yours?
No.
But that's okay.
Oh, here it is.
Yeah. So I would just offer as a kind of companion to the Steffer wife. As you were talking, I was thinking about another sort of like filmic meditation on the non-human and and so racialized femininity. And that's the movie Ex Machina, which I don't know if people have seen
Brilliant
recently,
movie.
right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that struck me about this particular scene is that the Black subjects are there to represent the real,
Yeah.
right? So they're the last of the real people. And the real people have arguments and unpleasantness and so forth, right? So there's something about Black bodies being so persistently tied to materiality. But what interests me about that, aside from the obvious, is that it actually, that tie to materiality actually erases the materialness of the Black body, right? That is to say, one of the sort of brilliant insight from your book is the other side of abstraction, right? What you're talking about, that is to say, not only is the materialism or realism, not only is realism itself already a kind of a protocol in the fantasy, but that actually abstraction aesthetic or abstractionism actually implodes the idea of materiality itself. Because the thing that's tied to the material is also the thing that is evacuated, right? And the reason why I think about Ex Machina is because, I don't know how many of you have seen it, it's about a Silicon Valley type genius who decided to invent the next step in human evolution by creating these AIs. And then it turns out, to the profound disappointment of, I assume, most people in the audience, that this great adventure into technology turned out to be, well, that is to say, he ended up using all these AI as his sex dolls. They're just very expensive sex dolls, right? And the one thing about this, and I mean, people have written about this movie, the gender politics, but nobody has actually mentioned something really weird in the movie, which is that all the AIs, with the exception of the protagonist, were Asian women in appearance. So that clearly the racial, erotic, machine aesthetic of the movie is tied to Asiatic femininity in a certain way. And my friend and colleague, Sadia Hartman, has said to me on the phone, that Asian thing is so strong that there's no room for Black female bodies in this movie. And I actually said to her, that's actually not true. There were actually 2 Black female bodies. They appear in a cut. They were literally 2 seconds. All you see is the room, 2 discarded headless Black female bodies. So you know that these are the discarded models. They're the failed models, right? And what you notice about them, aside from being discarded, is that they were much more corporeal, right? They were full body. They look more real. Unlike the Asian AIs, who were so slim that they look like machines, right? And that's part of their sleekness, right? But it's a really wonderful moment in which, the Black body is discarded precisely in its materiality, and something about the Black body being tied to the real is also precisely what allows the Black body to always be the thing that's under erasure, cut out of the room, discarded, and so forth. And so I just thought one of the really brilliant effects of this book is that it didn't just give us abstractionism. It totally undoes materialism in a way. So anyway, thank you for a beautiful book.
So I think we have time for questions. I wonder, Phil, if you want to jump right into the questions that have already been raised.
Yes. I have to say that Michael and Anne together, between the questions that they asked, really kind of delineated or showed the boundaries of the terrain that I very carefully laid out for myself as I was writing the book, so I wouldn't have to adjust those questions. I worked very assiduously as I was drafting it to adopt the terms of argument that seemed to be posited by the antagonists in the stories that I was telling. The terms of Kara Walker's critics, the terms of the opponents to Fred Wilson's sculpture, which worked really well by way of allowing me to produce a coherent manuscript. But it means that the book doesn't touch on those really important questions. I think it's fair to say, in response to you, Michael, that over the course of the years I've been working on the book, I have just about talked myself into a position where I think, I've never said this aloud before, that at least according to the theory that I work out here, that it is possible for African American art to be produced by someone who is not African American identified, with a big nimbus of problems around it. But on the other hand, I'm not sure that nimbus of problems doesn't obtain in the case of work that's produced by African American artists themselves. And so I guess what I am coming around to feel is that what really needs to be problematized is and this kind of gets to one of your points, Anne, the assumptions about what kind of art can be produced by certain marked persons. This speaks to the question of whether critique always has to be at issue, because I like to think that I don't think that it has to be at issue, and yet I haven't yet been able to figure out how one might escape it. And I think in working through that escape and in working toward a situation in which African American art, which I guess I think of as pro-black, anti-racist art, the possibility of it's being produced by someone who isn't identifying as African American, if I work through those two things simultaneously from different directions, I guess I feel like I might arrive at a fully satisfactory answer. Right now, what I have are hunches in both respects. That yes, it is theoretically possible, and yes, it is theoretically possible, to forego critique. Except that I guess what we know thus far is that when one forgoes critique, then one's work is judged as not being properly racial, and that's which many artists in working in all forms and genres have complained about for quite some time. So it's possible, but I guess the consequence of it is that the very terms by which we've come to understand, I would go so far as to say art per se, would have to be radically changed. But I also would say that I've derived great pleasure in thinking toward those positions, even though I haven't quite figured out how to arrive at them fully yet. And I think there's something to be said about that pleasure that is not adequately acknowledged in most conversations about racialized art that people have. So that might be a good way of opening up, Sonya. I don't know.
Can I ask one more? I want to ask one more question, I think, following from these responses. It seems to me that another real contribution of the book that we have touched on but maybe not talked about too much is that it's not only about under what circumstances this kind of critique or this kind of extractionism can be produced, but also how we can read it. Yeah. Right? I mean, I think Michael touched on this briefly when saying that sort of part of what we have to do is think about is what we think is real, is it really real, right? And that's part of what your book teaches us to do. And then I think Anne is also getting at that in her question about what other kinds of words we have available to talk about the things that you're talking about. So I just wonder if you want to talk a little bit more about what this book says, or even thinking you've had since finishing it, about how we read as students, as critics, as...
Yeah. I was thinking as you were talking, Michael, that I felt incredibly gratified by the examples that you offered up from recent film in particular, because you were enacting, and maybe you're doing this because we've talked about the book and you know what, this is what I want. Maybe you're just trying to appease me. But you were enacting what my fantasy had been for the book, which is that in addition to championing and advocating for a certain mode of aesthetic representation, the book would help people to receive whatever work is out there in a different way than they might have otherwise. So part of the argument is that the work doesn't have to be full-on abstractionist. The examples that I cite throughout the book and that I read by way of trying to demonstrate how they work, I select because they're so extreme in their abstractionism, but I hope that the payoff is that having worked through them, people will be enabled to engage in an abstractionist fashion with work that on the surface of it, at least according to our standard protocols, seems to be wholly realist in the way that you suggest, Precious is not really. And so I actually find that really gratifying. I've been wondering to myself whether that effect would be realized from the argument that I've made. And I'm just really happy that, at least in the case of one person, that is to say Michael, it has been. And so that, that gives me hope that others might find their way to that same way of reading, same way of viewing, same way of experiencing artworks.
Thank you all. I guess my question is sort of similar to Professor Cheng's about the idea of efficacy. And I mean, I haven't read the book, so I guess I'll have to read it to find out. But I guess I wonder how you balance thinking about like analyzing the efficacy of a work on both formal, like in the work's formal, in terms of like formal readings of the work, as well as, or like do you approach that as, and how do you integrate like a formal reading of like a film in addition to the conceptual reading of the like
Yeah, that's a really good question. The readings that I offer up in the book, which I strike me as sort of sketchy. I mean, I try to use them as jumping off points for theoretical elaboration, so they're not as in-depth as they might otherwise be. But they are there, and I think of them as moving along formalist lines, that it's the form of whatever work I'm looking at that precipitates the critical effect that I'm suggesting is made possible. Let's put it that way. Not that it's necessarily achieved, but it's made possible. Because, of course, this is one of my frustrations as a literature scholar, at least the type of literature scholar that I have been trained to be, is that so much of what we do, and I think this is true of a lot of work in the humanities that focuses on art and interpretation, is really about speculation in ways that we don't acknowledge. I mean, I pick up this work and I read it and I see that it seems to mean this. Whether it's meaning this for other people is a complete unknown on my part. And so when it comes to questions of efficacy in the book, I do one of two things. I either very carefully say, I think, this artwork, whatever it might be, seems to make available this interpretation, which can be efficacious in this particular way. Or I say, and this is why I start with controversies, this work has been received in this fashion. And not by scholars and critics, but by what we might think of as lay audiences. Because it's those effects that I'm most interested in. So yeah, I work along formal lines. I also am working along conceptual lines, as you suggest, but I'm trying to temper those modes throughout the book with fairly frequent reference to actual responses among readers, viewers, participants in the world, and a careful hedging of what I'm saying is actually brought about by the potentially efficacious work that I'm examining. So there's what strikes me. I can't tell anymore. I can't read anymore. But there's what I think potentially manifests as an incredible amount of caution as I work through the readings, because I don't want to. I don't want to impute readings and modes of reception to people that are not actually extant in the world.
And I just had another really quick question, but sure. I guess also just thinking about like, what do you do, or do you treat any artists who would be considered abstract conventionally?
No, not in this final version. No. And the reason for that is that this goes back to what I was saying earlier. I embarked on the project really trying to take seriously what seemed to be the demands of critics of the work of the artists. So I took for granted as I proceeded that the work has to, in some way, whatever way that might be, represent or register its racial political import. There might be ways in which you can do that through frank abstraction, though I would argue that if it's doing it, it probably isn't as abstract as we think it is. But since the test that I wanted to undertake really had to do with how balanced could a work be on the razor's edge between representationalism and abstractionism and still function in the critical manner that I am positing, that I think critics are asking for. That led me to pretty much forego a thorough engagement with abstraction per se. So there's some, but it's usually by way of, I invoke it and discuss it by way of laying out the parameters of the terrain that I'm going to be most preoccupied with. Sometimes I engage it in order to demonstrate why abstraction has elicited such negative response and such suspicion on the part of people of color. So sometimes I will say, this looks like a purely abstract painting. How could it not be? It's only a grid. And yet, it embedded within it is a whole aesthetic and political history that is problematic with respect to the positions of peoples of color. And so it ends up not being all that abstract after all. But as far as real abstract works by Black artists, there aren't very many in the book.
I guess I was just wondering, because you might know this, but in art history, there's been this huge revival of interest in 20th century Black painters who are abstract.
I do know that, yeah.
Jack Whitman, Alma Thomas. So I guess when I saw the title of the talk, I was like, oh, I wonder if he's going to talk about what the revival of interest in those artists means and how that discourse is structured. But that's another book project.
Yeah, it is. But I'm really glad you asked that question because, I wasn't joking. In an earlier version of this manuscript, I did talk about such artists. I talked about Alma Thomas. I had illustrations of her paintings. And I talked about the limits to African-American expressive art those works seem to represent for a lot of people. And then I decided that in order to make the argument more coherent and tighter, I both didn't need those discussions and shouldn't have them.
I want to jump in just because I think, so here would be my proof that what I think about the book is not based on what I think you want, but just based on what resonated with me, because I think I would even use different language to explain what's happening in the book, but I think it's something interesting that this question raises. So when I think about like the argument or the way Phil treats texts and objects and things like that, I think to myself that all of the objects he's discussing are historicized, right? So I think like what he's calling a kind of focus on the controversies is more also just sort of trying to situate the objects, trying to make sense of how they're being received in the world or what kinds of social tensions or historical transformations they are illuminating or that they're embedded in, and that's why the controversies seem useful as an heuristic, because it shows what is animating certain kinds of tensions. But in his analysis, I feel like, and this is related to the question I asked, it's kind of interesting that I sort of posed the question about identity, and Phil in different moments, even tonight, has said that for him, African-American art is linked to sort of a critical stance around race or something like that. But actually, I think if I think of the constituency that interests him, or sort of the constituency implied in the book, it's more like the constituency is people who are critical, And maybe the argument is something like what it means to be African American is to be critical, or something like that, or like what it means to be African American is to be emancipatory, or something like that. And so you could say specifically the African American struggles like enslavement and then civil rights, etc. But also other people share that freedom struggle. So it's more like that's the constituency of what the sort of vehicle is. What it means is to being critical. The constituency is people invested in emancipation, and the adversary is like empiricism or something like that, or positivism. And that's why I feel like the argument about abstractionism is so interesting and so profound, because it's like the adversary is anybody who reads things too literally, or thinks of things in a mundane way, or thinks of things in an overly cliched, conventional way. That's kind of really interesting. I find that really provocative and really productive, actually.
And
right?
Actually, that's one of the reasons why I think it's actually, are there any social scientists in the room here?
I think I still count. I still count as a social
scientist.
Okay,
don't get mad at me for saying this.
Fine.
But I think the reason I think it's a great argument for the humanities is like when you show those grids, it made me think of Du Bois's maps, Philadelphia and so forth. That there's a way in which we think that the grids or the maps or the charts tell us something, right? And there's a certain kind of assumption behind a certain kind of quantitative practice that is completely false or illusory. Yeah. And your book really shows that. you know. And in that way, it's such a strong, that's what I mean by it's a really strong argument for the humanities.
I'm so excited to read this book. I had a question about accessibility, and one thing that it seems coming through from this conversation is that accessibility is simultaneously an opportunity and a real problem, the problem of accessibility. And it also feels like what you're doing is showing us how race complicates the very categories of abstraction and realism, in the sense that for subjects who experience hypervisibility alongside invisibility, right? Sort of hyper visualization alongside underrepresentation, then those categories get really complicated. And so on the one hand, I guess I just was curious about, it seems like the act of reading this book can help us learn to read what we are seeing better than we might otherwise read. But I guess the other side of the question I have about this is, are you giving up on the visual? And are there visual practices that can help us learn to read what we are seeing? Like, do you think there are, have you reached this point where you're like, the visual just, it's so oversaturated that we just get caught up in the same debates and arguments? Or are there any do you feel like there are possibilities in the visual or is it really a question of we have to turn to narrative to learn how to read what we're seeing?
That is such a great question.
Help, I know.
Yeah.
We need an answer.
And it makes me, again, think of one of Anne's questions. I haven't given up on the visual as a person. I think that's the way I would put it. I am skeptical about its ability to register any degree of substantive social analysis. That doesn't mean I don't like it. And when I say I haven't given up on it as an individual, as a person, I think I mean that I am drawn to instances of visual beauty that still seem to me potentially to speak to questions of racial politics, though not necessarily in a way that can be rendered comprehensible in terms of critique. And I also, this is a slightly different tack, but I have become somewhat impatient, and I don't think I'm alone in this, with the degree to which the spectacular character of the visual has effectively preempted other ways of engaging aesthetically in the contemporary moment. So I'm leery about it. I haven't given up on it. But again, I know, Christina, I just sound like a broken record here. Within the book itself, because I am trying so assiduously to adopt the terms of the critics as the terms on which I'm going to base my own argument, and because critique is so central to what antagonists of, say, Kara Walker want to see in art, in as much as I am skeptical about how well visuality can register critique at this juncture, I am leery. I really am. And I think that has to do with a particular historical moment in which we're living.
Thank you. This has just been a fascinating conversation. I can't wait to read the book. And I guess I just wanted, my question I think has been answered in pieces, but I just wanted maybe a chance to sort of pull it together, which is, I mean, unlike Warren or Michael's, where, especially Warren, I'm thinking, where the question is like, what was African-American literature? You're talking about African-Americanist critique. And I'm just wondering if you could like maybe elaborate or tell us exactly what you mean by that particular conjuncture of like African-Americanist and critique together.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. What I mean in a pretty basic sense is the turning of a kind of analytical lens onto contemporary, and I think for my purposes it's always contemporary. That is to say, contemporaneous with whatever moment in which it's happening, with whichever moment in which it's being consumed. It's the turning of an analytical lens onto the racial the contemporary current racial political dispensation with the interests of black people in view. That's what I mean by African Americanist critique, the interests of black people in the United States. And I don't think that that is the definition of black art or of African American art. To go back again to a question that Anne raises, but or that it doesn't have to be, but to the extent that it is, then here are the ways in which it seems to me feasible to be forwarded. Yeah.
I think we should probably break soon.
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah. Can I ask one last question?
If you must.
Can I take my privilege as moderator? I just wonder all these questions about the position of the critic and the interpreter and the reader and accessibility. I wonder if you want to say anything about how these questions are taking you in this new ethnographic.
Oh, sure. Well, this goes back to the answer that I was giving to the question about how my readings work and what I said about the speculative character of so much of what those of us who are literature scholars do. As you maybe have been able to glean, I've become increasingly frustrated with those limits. And I am, for that very reason, ever more interested in finding out how is it that Jane Doe receives this piece of literature. How is it that she responds to this artwork in this gallery? Someone who is not caught up in the debates about representation, about critique that are animating me and so many of my colleagues within the academy, but who might rise up, who might be the sort of person who rises up in protest over a Kara Walker piece or did in 1997, to give that kind of careful analytical attention. So it was through working on this book that I came to decide that I really had to start engaging with what I called earlier, lay readers, lay consumers of the artwork in order to figure out exactly what it is they're taking from these practices so as to burst the insularity of the academy itself, and the bubble within which so many of us operate in these speculative readings. So it might not be evident, but there's a real direct connection between the highly speculative theoretical work that I'm doing here and that next project that I don't really have a clue how to do. But I'm going to do it anyway.
Great. Thank you all for coming, and please buy books, and I think there's wine.
Yes, and drink wine. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.